I'm going to start with a prayer tonight, and then we'll proceed. Lord, we thank you for this time. We thank you, Lord. It is a constant marvel to me to see the technology of our age being harnessed for good, and we thank you, Lord, that we are able to meet together from different parts of the United States and even different parts of the world as we talk about and learn about the history of modern Israel and what you have done in the last few decades, Lord, in bringing your covenant people back into the land. And we ask you to bless this night for your glory in Jesus' name. I want to thank everybody for being on tonight. I'm going to go ahead and just because I'm going to be. All right. So we have been going through the history of modern Israel, and we have last week we got to the Israeli War of Independence in 1948 and learning a lot of the amazing ways that God was with his covenant people and bringing them back into the land. I feel it's a fascinating story, and we do have these. I've posted all three of them are on our YouTube channel. You can, it's also on our app as well. So you're welcome to go to either of those places. So tonight is going to be a little bit different. We're going to talk about the 1967 war between that it's commonly called the Six-Day War, and it's really fascinating to me. In this case, there is some wonderful information out there, so some great videos that for me to sit here and lecture about it would be kind of like reinventing the wheel because there's things out there that I think would be a lot more interesting way of showing it. So what we're going to do, I've got a kind of a little bit of a preamble, I guess you might say, of what happened between 1948 and 1967. There's a short video by PragerU, which, by the way, there's a whole series of videos that they have out on the history of modern Israel by Michael Oren, who is a very esteemed historian in Israel. And we're going to watch one of those that kind of gives you the overview of that war and what happened during that time. And then we're going to start watching a much longer video. It was actually called In Our Hands, and it was produced by CBN a number of years ago. We're going to see part of that tonight, and then we're going to go one more week, and we're going to finish that up next time. It's about the 67 war, but specifically about the part of the war in which Jerusalem was, the old city of Jerusalem and the Western Wall was recovered by Israel. And I think you'll enjoy it. So that's just kind of like an overview of what we're doing tonight. And so I'm going to go with this. So we left the last time with the War of Independence that ended in early 1949. On January 25th of 1949, Israel held its first national elections. Then the next year, in July 5th of 1950, the Knesset, which is their version of our House of Representatives and Senate, enacted the Law of Return, which gave every Jew the right to immigrate to Israel. Another law was enacted at the same time, and it granted these immigrants full citizenship immediately upon arrival. And this is something I didn't realize, that if you're Jewish and you have the right to immigrate to Israel, no questions asked, and upon your arrival, you are considered a citizen, which I think is pretty amazing. So in the first 42 months of the state's existence, the average monthly number of new immigrants reached some 16,000 in 1 month. All in all, 690,000 immigrants arrived in Israel, and within 3 years, the Jewish population doubled. By 1967, Israel was home to 2.5 million people, the vast majority of them being Jewish. Most of these new immigrants to Israel were desperately poor. Israel itself was a fledgling state, and it had to provide everything for them until they could get on their feet. So just, I think this is one of those miracles that it's hard to define, but just the fact that they were able to get on their feet and bring in all these people, and rather than it being a destruction to them, it was a great boon to them because the people came in and they got to work. In 1953, the state of Israel was 5 years old. The War of Independence had ended more than 4 years earlier, but Israel's citizens now faced regular attacks by Palestinian infiltrators crossing the Jordanian and Egyptian borders. The attacks were relentless. So in a way, the war never really ended. In the 3 years following independence, there were thousands of such infiltrations and attacks each year. And Israel was forced to strike back to secure its borders, and it did this many times. By the mid-1950s, Israel had the world's fastest growing economy, ahead of even Germany and Japan in that era of recovering from World War II. In 1956, the Suez Crisis occurred between Israel and Egypt. This was really the second war between Israel and the Arab lands. France and Great Britain were secretly backing Israel against Egyptian President Abdel Nasser. Israel came out on top on that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. It was a very confusing little war they had. There is a PragerU video called Israel at War 1956 that we're not going to watch tonight. I'll put it on our Telegram that you're welcome to watch. I found it interesting, but just for time constraints, we're not going to try to do that tonight. So by 1967, the Jewish state had survived an onslaught of unrelenting attacks, had absorbed over 1 million immigrants, and had emerged as a player on the international stage. It was quickly cultivating national, political, and cultural traditions. Many challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, but 19 years after its founding, Israel had fared far better than anyone might have dared imagine when the United Nations had voted in November 1947 to create a Jewish state. So to me, it was an ongoing miracle, just the fact that it was able to establish itself and become a viable part of the Middle East and of the world. But on the flip side, Jerusalem was still divided. In the War of Independence back in 1948, the fledgling Israel Defense Forces had been unable to hold onto the eastern portions of Jerusalem and the Old City, which was now in Jordanian hands, and we talked about that last week. For nearly 2 decades, a wall of cinder block and barbed wire ran through the heart of the country's capital. Even if the Israeli government was prepared to live with that, for many Jews, most particularly, but certainly not exclusively in the religious community, it was a wound that refused to heal. So we're going to watch this PragerU 5-minute video by Michael Oren that's going to give you an overview of what happened at that point, and then I'll come back in after that. So just give me a moment here to switch over.
Few events in modern history were as dramatic as the Six-Day War of June 1967, the war between Israel and 4 Arab nations, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. Among other things, it changed the nature of the Middle East, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict transferred control of the West Bank from Jordan to Israel and unleashed Islamic extremism. The origins of the war were complex. They began with the rise of Pan-Arabism, which sought to unite the countries, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan, created by the Europeans after World War I, and into a single Arab state. The question was, who would lead that state? In their efforts to claim that role, Arab rulers tried to outdo one another in attacking Israel. Foremost among them was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic leader of the most powerful Arab country, Egypt. To establish his leadership on May 16, 1967, Nasser evicted the UN peacekeepers who served as a buffer between Israel and Egypt in the Sinai Desert and the Gaza Strip, which was then under Egyptian control. Nasser marched his army into the Sinai and threatened to drive the Jews into the sea. He blockaded the Straits of Tiran at the entrance to the Red Sea, choking off Israel's vital southern port of Eilat. He made a military alliance with Syria and Iraq. He placed the Jordanian army under Egyptian command. By the first week of June 1967, Israel was surrounded. On its southern border, the army of Egypt. On its eastern border, the armies of Jordan and Iraq. On its northern border, the army of Syria. And on its western border, the Mediterranean Sea. And to make matters worse, Israel faced these threats virtually alone. It had a tenuous relationship with Europe and friendly ties with the United States, but not a strategic alliance. The Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, fought with French arms, not American arms. And of course, the Soviets were antagonistic, having fully backed Nasser. The situation was life and death. The normally fractious political parties of the Jewish state formed a national unity government with the dour Levi Eshkol as prime minister and the famed one-eyed general Moshe Dayan as defense minister. The existential question of the moment for Israel's politicians and generals was this: should Israel wait for the inevitable attack and react, or should it strike preemptively? And if it did, what if that attack should fail? After much arguing and agonizing, Israel's leaders chose to attack. At 7:45 on the morning of June 5th, Israel launched one of the largest airstrikes in military history. The Egyptians were caught completely by surprise. In a matter of hours, Israeli planes wiped out 3/4 of Egypt's air force, most of it on the ground. This gave Israel command of the skies, a major tactical advantage. Then Israeli ground forces rushed into the Sinai. Their goal was to neutralize the Egyptian threat, and by doing so, hopefully dissuade other Arab states from joining the fray. Israel repeatedly urged Jordan's King Hussein to stay out of it. It didn't work. In a matter of hours, Israel was fighting a three-front war. Jordanian forces fired thousands of artillery shells into West Jerusalem and the Tel Aviv area and attacked Israeli positions along the eastern border. Syria, too, rained thousands of shells down onto Israeli towns and villages in the Galilee. Israel responded as if the nation's life depended on it. It did. In the open spaces of the Sinai Desert, Israeli jets pulverized Egyptian forces from above, while Israeli ground troops and tanks sent the Egyptians reeling back toward the Suez Canal. Meanwhile, in the tight quarters of Jerusalem, Israeli paratroopers advanced into the eastern half of the city. By the third day of the war, the Jordanian and Egyptian armies were in full retreat. Israeli soldiers conquered all the Sinai up to the Suez Canal. Responding to the Palestinian attacks from Gaza, the IDF captured the Strip as well. Most dramatically, on the morning of June 7th, Israeli paratroopers realized a 2,000-year-old Jewish dream of reuniting East and West Jerusalem and liberating the Old City. "The Temple Mount is in our hands," Commander Mota Gur reported as his troops danced in front of the Western Wall. Only the Syrian front remained, with Syrian artillery still pounding Israel's north. Though fearful the Soviets would enter the war in defense of their ally, Moshe Dayan determined that the opportunity of securing the high ground of Israel's northern border, the Golan Heights, could not be missed. Advancing under furious Syrian fire, Israeli forces achieved their objective. In 6 earth-shaking days, it was all over. Israel had defeated multiple Arab armies, convincing American leaders to ally with the Jewish state and provide it with arms. The world was stunned. A country of nearly 2.5 million people had defeated an Arab world of over 100 million. A country 8 miles wide at its narrowest point before the war had quadrupled the territory under its control. But many challenges loomed, not the least of which was what to do with over 1 million Palestinians now under Israeli authority. That question would preoccupy Israeli political, diplomatic, and military thinking for many decades to come, and still does to this day. I'm Michael Oren, author of 6 Days of War for Prager University. Thank you for watching this.
I thought that was very good and kind of give you the overview of the war in a very short time. Some things that really strike me about this. It's hard. I mean, you really just cannot see what happened and not know that the hand of God was with Israel in this. That in 6 days, actually, one of the sources that I came across when they talked about the initial attack, when Israel preemptively attacked, they destroyed the Egyptian army, and essentially the war was won before it ever started for Israel, because that put Israel and Egypt and all the other countries at a distinct advantage. But there was much bloodshed to come. So when we look at what's happening today and we hear about the West Bank, which is really Judea and Samaria, we hear about Gaza, those were taken by Israel during the 6 Day War. And so as well, the eastern part of Jerusalem, and that's what we're going to be watching here in a moment. So much of the conflict that we have right now goes back to that, and these were areas that were rightly won by Israel. They also won the Sinai Desert, and years later they would give that back. If you've heard of the peace treaty and the Camp David peace treaty in the late 70s with Jimmy Carter, they gave that back and to Egypt, and they're kind of paying for that even today. So that really kind of gives you an idea of some of the things that we're dealing with in Israel go all the way back to 67. Of course, a lot of them all the way back to 48. But so I'd like to just one moment here. So we're going to, this video is it's actually a movie, I guess you might say. It's almost 2 hours long. We're not going to watch all of that. We're going to watch a good chunk of it tonight, and then we're going to finish it up next week. We're going to start after about the first 30 minutes of it. Where we're joining in, a lot of the beginning minutes of it is preliminary, and a lot of it was covered in what we just saw. But there's two people that you're going to see. They're being portrayed, and one was the chief intelligence officer of the 55th Brigade. His name was Arik Akmon, and you'll see him interviewed here as well as being portrayed by somebody else. He was commissioned to drop a plan to attack El Arish in Egypt before the war began by Colonel Mota Gur, and he's the commander of the 55th Brigade. He became very famous in this war. And where we pick up the video, Mota is giving Achman a new plan to draw up, and this time is a plan to defend Israel. So we're going to jump into that here in just a moment.
While the rest of the paratroopers prepared for a jump in the Sinai, Mota and Arik made plans for a very different battle in Jerusalem.
Mota, what are we doing here? We should be working on the plans for El Arish.
I don't want to be caught by surprise here. Now that Jordan signed a pact with Egypt, we can't rule out an attack on Jerusalem. Look, our convoys to Mount Scopus would be perfect targets. If the Jordanians can take out a convoy, they can take the outpost.
Okay, so what do you need?
We need a plan to defend the outpost. I need you to get me a preliminary intelligence report on Jerusalem.
Mota, that's a full night's work. It will take time away from the El Arish plan.
Just do it.
We have all the information about El Arish, about Egypt's forces. Nothing about the Jordanians. We know nothing. Quite nothing. I have exactly 10 hours to prepare a unit to war. Usually, to make our operation in Jerusalem, you need about 40 hours. It's a craziness. For an intelligence officer to El Arish, we have 3 weeks. Here, 10 hours.
Arik was not only short on time, but also on information. Other units had already claimed all but a few of the maps and photos of Jerusalem.
This is a catastrophe.
While Arik and Mota created a backup plan to defend Jerusalem, the rest of the brigade was flying over Israel's Mediterranean coastline, preparing for their jump in the Sinai.
We parachuted Saturday night in an area south of Ashdod. Our exercise was to take over Ashkelon just in the same way as El Arish.
On Sunday morning, the news rumbled through the 55th Brigade. The war would start today. The paratroopers were moved to the runways of the Tel Nof Air Base, where they strapped on their parachutes and waited for orders.
Suddenly they said red sheet, which was the code meaning that war has broken out.
7:30, all the ground was shaking.
The planes were taking off 2 at a time and flying in groups of 4. They flew just 30 meters above the sea, so they wouldn't be detected by radar, all with total radio silence. Exactly at 7:10 in the morning, they rose up above the Nile Delta. Then every plane came down in order to surprise the Egyptians while they were having breakfast. Yitzhak Rabin came and looked around for a few minutes silently. Then he said, "The fate of the Jewish people is in your hands now and today. If we win, the sky is the limit. But if you fail, and this I remember, if you fail, there is no one to help after that. We have no reserves. We have no planes left here. There are only 4 Mirages left to defend the state of Israel." Then, without another word, he left.
We were scared to think about how many of the planes would come back.
But after about 40 minutes, the first wave come back and the second wave go. We understand something with us will not go according to plan.
We had a radio, and everybody was listening to it. The Voice of Israel had a very quick report saying that the Egyptians had opened fire, and our forces were shooting back. They didn't say anything more.
It was only at 8 in the evening that we were told that the Syrian and Egyptian air forces had been destroyed.
Several hours later, Mota Gur appeared with news for the paratroopers. Israeli forces had moved faster through the Sinai than expected, and the 55th Brigade was no longer needed. But a new front had opened up.
The Voice of Israel reported that there were bombings in Jerusalem. The Jordan had opened fire, and there were fatalities. Snipers were shooting at the King David Hotel, and everyone needed to prepare for a blackout at night. Jordanian mortars had also hit the Knesset as well.
When the shelling began, Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol sent a message to Jordan's King Hussein. "Stay out of the war, and we won't attack you." Hussein ignored the message, a mistake he would later regret. The 55th Brigade was ordered to Jerusalem to protect the Jewish half of the city. Among the paratroopers, the reaction was mixed.
I remember when they told us the mission had been cancelled. I let out a sigh of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted off my shoulders.
The first mission we had been assigned in the Sinai was the most complicated ever assigned in the IDF. I think that had we carried it out, there would have been many more casualties than the number we had suffered while fighting in Jerusalem.
On the one hand, I was happy, because I had a pregnant wife in Jerusalem. Did she have the baby or didn't she? Was she okay? I really didn't know anything. But on the other hand, we didn't want to be a protection force. Paratroopers are the best trained men. You don't send them to babysit the borders.
We are frustrated. We prepare for 3 weeks a very interesting operation. To cut it in an hours was a very bad feeling, and we know that our comrades is in the middle of the fight.
I remember the regiment commander speaking, trying to take the tension from us and calming us down. He emphasized 2 principles to us. Don't steal and don't hurt captives who surrender, and put their weapons down. Those were the 2 principles that walked with us to the war in Jerusalem.
That afternoon, the 55th Brigade boarded buses and jeeps bound for Jerusalem. When they reached the outskirts of the city, they got their first taste of war.
I knew Jerusalem very well, so it was shocking for me to see the raging fires, the bombed-out places, and the streets full of shattered glass from the windows that had been hit. I remember this initial shock quite well.
the smell of shells exploding and smoke. I remember we could smell that things were getting serious. Ambulances, fire trucks, smoke, fire, rocket explosions. Not a living soul around. This is how we reached the headquarters of the Jerusalem Brigade.
Inside the city, the paratroopers received a hero's welcome.
It was unbelievable. From every house, from every courtyard, a mother, a grandmother, came out with cakes and rice, and I can't remember what else. They said, take food. It was incredible. Take food. People came from all over. They didn't care about the bombings. Women brought food, sweets, coffee, everything. You cannot describe it. It was spontaneous love. As if people feel you're paratroopers, you're going somewhere. Take something.
We found ourselves in the home of a family named Cohen. The father is a lawyer. He and his wife have 2 daughters in high school, and a grandmother who is 80 years old. I'm explaining to her what our mission is about.
It's possible that we will get into the old city. In a few days, we could be at the Temple Mount and Western Wall.
Be careful. When you go anywhere near the border, they will throw stones at you.
Stones. Much worse.
יודע, בסדר, אבל מה?
Boys, I brought you a flag. This flag flew in the old city before we left in 1948. When you get to the wall, I want you to hang this flag.
Of course. It will be our honor.
You need to know that the whole Jewish nation is behind you, pushing you towards the wall. Not just us, but many generations. May God be with you and bring you back in peace.
And there was really this feeling that the yearning of generations is finally being answered. When we left, I went to each bus for a short briefing. In every bus, I showed the map and explained the plan. I told them when we get orders, we will go to the Western Wall. And this is the flag we will hang there. The soldiers are shouting, and the next bus was joining in even more loudly. And I really had a feeling that they were ready, and that they were willing to do whatever it takes.
That night, commanders from each battalion gathered on a rooftop in West Jerusalem. Here, they were briefed on the plan that Motta and Arik had put together.
71st Battalion, you will cut through Wadi Joz and head for Augusta Victoria. 66th Battalion, you will go through the Mendelbaum Gate and seize Ammunition Hill. And 28th Battalion, cut through the American Colony and Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and take the Rockefeller Archaeological Museum. That's where we set up headquarters.
The brigade will carry out this mission at all costs. We are facing 2 battalions of Jordanian legionnaires. They are the best, most experienced soldiers Jordan has. They are not Palestinian Arabs. They are all Bedouins, and they are loyal to the king. They will not run. They will fight to the death. So tell your men, either put a bullet in their heads or a grenade in their posts. Good luck to all of you.
Good luck.
All 3 battalions were set to move into Jordanian territory under cover of darkness. 0 hour was at 2:15 a.m. on the 6th of June.
Fighting in an urban area is the most complicated kind of fighting there is and requires a lot of planning. Therefore, we viewed our battle in Jerusalem as encounter fighting, meaning you get a rather unspecified mission. You don't know where the enemy is or when they're going to open fire. So the only thing we knew was where we were supposed to arrive. And we knew we were going to get there, but we had no idea what was going to happen on the way there.
On the rooftop of their West Jerusalem headquarters, the Israelis had placed 2 giant spotlights. 5 minutes before 0 hour, they turned on the lights, signaling the start of the mission. At 2:15, the 28th Battalion broke through the Jordanian border. They moved through East Jerusalem to set up headquarters at the Rockefeller Archaeological Museum, just across from the old city walls. But the neighborhood was completely dark. Many of the men had never been to Jerusalem, and they had very few maps. All this led to a wrong turn that proved to be disastrous. Instead of taking a quiet street that led to the museum, they stumbled into a Jordanian barrage. One paratrooper later recalled that the street turned into a slaughterhouse. Eventually, the Israelis prevailed, and the Jordanians withdrew. Only 30 paratroopers, half of the original group, left the battle unharmed. The Israelis later referred to the street as the Alley of Death.
3 brigades, all of them in 10 hours change all their plans. Instead of defending the area, to attacking. 10 hours. But you learn in years of preparation, of maneuvers, how to do this. And we done it. And we pay for it. And our payment was very, very high. But we done it.
That night, Israel Ha'il's job was taking injured soldiers from the battle to a nearby hospital.
The soldiers who were not injured carried the wounded to a nearby hospital. My wife and her family were staying in a shelter about 600 meters from the hospital, so I decided to run and check on her. I was there at sunrise, covered with the blood of the people I carried. When the door opened, I did not recognize anyone in the dark, but I was in the light, so they recognized me. My wife ran towards me with a belly so big. It turned out that she had not given birth yet. I can't describe this meeting to you. My son was only 5 years old then, and he was really afraid to come out. In the shelter, they were told that when the paratroopers had arrived in Jerusalem, the Jordanians had killed them all. That was the rumor in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods.
The 66th Battalion faced the heaviest fighting of the night, in a battle that became known as the bloodiest in Arab-Israeli history.
When the battle at Ammunition Hill started, no one dared to dream about the Western Wall. No one thought about the old city. No one dreamed about being part of a big historic tale. The paratroopers came here to complete a dark task, to capture a few dangerous territories in East Jerusalem. That was their task.
One of those dangerous territories was Ammunition Hill, an old British weapons depot that had been seized by Jordan in 1948. Jordanian forces used the hill northeast of the city to launch artillery attacks against Jewish Jerusalem. At 2:15 a.m., the Israelis started to climb the hill, using torpedoes to blast their way through the minefields and razor wire fences. By the time the last fence was cut, more than a dozen paratroopers had been injured and 7 were dead.
I was 10 months old when my dad was killed about 250 meters away from where we are sitting now. He knew how to mess with explosives like you know how to mess with a fork and a knife. And he took command and started to work on the last explosion. The drill is that 2 guys with flashlights jump first into the smoke and everyone else runs into the hole that was made to avoid the enemy fire coming their way. My father knew this drill very well and wanted to earn every possible second for his men. He had planned this beforehand. He took the flashlight from the signaler's vest, jumped ahead and yelled, "Onward, through here!" And while he was doing it, he took 2 or 3 bullets into his chest and collapsed. But my father's corpse was still showing them the way in. There was no time to think, no time to talk, no time to regret. They all charged in on top of my father, and the rest is history.
At the bottom of the hill, the Israelis came under heavy fire. Because the shots came from so many different directions, Ammunition Hill later became known as the Triangle of Fire. Israeli tanks got stuck in the minefields and barbed wire, so the paratroopers abandoned them and proceeded on foot. Most of them had not been trained for trench warfare, and they were forced to improvise at every turn. The trenches were barely wide enough for 1 man at a time.
I'm running ahead of this whole group, together with my soldiers. In front of me, I have 3 soldiers. We didn't stop. People sometimes ask me if I'm sure that all of my soldiers were following me. I answer that I don't know. I only see the 3 ones running in front of me. We knew that if we stop, it is dangerous.
You're scared until the first shot. The moment when things become real. The minute the first shot is being fired, you're bent on completing your mission. I can speak for myself when I say this, but you're petrified before that moment. Then shaking all over after it, but all throughout it, you're focused on carrying out your mission.
Facing relentless fire, some of the paratroopers advanced the only way they knew how: by sacrificing their lives.
You can't win a battle when you're running inside a narrow tunnel. You must send someone outside to be the lookout, to be your covering fire to allow the other guys to run forward. About 30 meters from where we currently stand, one of the officers sent his machine gunner private outside to cover fire.
If you leave here, you won't be coming back.
But if I don't leave, none of you will be coming back. Just let me do my job.
He ran and took those bullets and fired an impossible amount of bullets and kills a large amount of people. Some say he was able to hit 20 Jordanian soldiers. Then he got shot in the head and fell into the trench. Afterwards, they counted the bullets in his body. After 18, they stopped counting. The amount of enemy fire that hit him could have stopped an elephant.
At a certain point, I tried talking to the soldiers who were in front of me. While I was shouting at them, I was hit on my arm and face, and I fell onto the ground. All my soldiers were hit also. My paramedic lost his arm, and another man was killed.
The Israelis were hit hard, but they continued to advance up the hill.
I had this idea to get 2 tanks up Ammunition Hill, very innocently, not realizing how rough the battle was. I climbed on one of the tanks, my commanding sergeant up on another tank, and like dummies, we rode up to the top of the hill. As I was leaning against the opening of the tank, I could hear shots being fired. I could feel the skin of my hands peeling off, and I realized the shots flew past me. And as I was turning around, I could see a Jordanian soldier charging after he had shot me. It occurred to me that I would need 2 seconds to turn around, grab my Uzi, and fire back at him. It was a matter of life or death. Not even 1 second later, I could hear shots being fired again, and the Jordanian soldier fell. The sergeant who was riding the other tank saved my life. I told the tank commander to shoot at the Jordanians around us, but he said the hill was so steep that he could not lower the cannon to shoot. We stand there, in the two monsters, and the only thing we could do was fire our Uzis. For many years after that, I had this bad feeling about not being able to help more. Only when we were able to interview a Jordanian officer years later did we realize what had happened. He said that they fought bravely until they saw the tanks rolling in. Then the moment they saw the tanks, they realized the battle was lost, took their remaining forces and deserted the hill.
By 4:30 a.m., the Israelis had reached the Jordanians' command bunker. The grenades they threw left only a few scratches on the concrete walls. So, for the next 45 minutes, they lined the opening of the bunker with 21 pounds of TNT. Less than 4 hours after the Israelis launched their attack, the battle was over.
When the sun rose in the east above Mount Scopus, the paratroopers from the 66th understood that they had lost most of their platoon. And those who weren't injured in their bodies were injured in their souls. They were in a state of shock.
After the battle, the few Jordanians who were still standing escaped into the desert, leaving behind their wounded and dead. The Jordanians had lost 71 men, and the Israelis 36. Of the 260 soldiers who fought at Ammunition Hill, only 11 emerged without being wounded or killed.
Since the beginning of the State of Israel, I don't think there has ever been a battle that called for more dedication and devotion than the Battle of Jerusalem. People sacrificed themselves in order to fulfill the mission.
Everyone always asks me how I felt when I was wounded. I can tell you that I felt that this is the end. I'm not getting out of there anymore. This was the feeling. As I've heard from other soldiers in the same situation, they had the same feeling. In those situations, they see their wives and children saying goodbye to them. And I saw those same things. They had already covered me up completely, because they were sure I was dead. Then at the last moment, someone saw that my fingers were still moving. The paramedic came, and he saved my life. Since everything was outside, and he put it back in. They took me to the hospital and saved my life.
After the battle, the paratroopers buried the last of the Jordanian soldiers in a mass grave on Ammunition Hill, with an epitaph that honored their bravery.
Here lay 17 brave Jordanian soldiers, IDF 1967. They wrote it in English. They wrote it with a pure heart. They wrote it for the whole world. They did something here that is part of IDF's DNA, part of Israel's DNA, and it's part of this heroic story we tell here. For over 2 hours, they dug a mass grave right here for the 17 dead Jordanian soldiers. The task of burying them is a hard task physically and should not be taken for granted. This isn't Sparta. This is Israel. We're not praising heroism. We're not praising death or war. We praise life.
By 8 o'clock that morning, all 3 battalions had accomplished their missions. The 66th had taken Ammunition Hill. The 71st had taken a strategic position at the base of Mount Scopus. And the 28th had taken the Rockefeller Museum, where Mother Gur set up his headquarters. In his mind, This was the ideal place for a final attack on the old city, if and when that order ever came. On the afternoon of June the 6th, 3 generals gathered on Mount Scopus for a briefing on the previous night's battles. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, Central Commander Uzi Narkis, and the IDF's Chief of Operations, Ezra Weitzman. Doron Mor, the Deputy Commander of Battalion 66, had just finished the cleanup at Ammunition Hill and was assigned to escort them.
This was the first time I saw Jerusalem from the east. We heard the birds singing, no shooting, no bombings, no fire, and I see Jerusalem from the east. You know, Jerusalem from the east is very beautiful. I was very impressed by the silence, and after a night full of war noises, soldiers killed and wounded, suddenly silence.
Where else can you find a view like that, huh?
Everyone is in position. I'm requesting permission to enter the old city immediately.
Under no circumstances.
But, sir...
But nothing. If we break through those walls now, the whole world will stand on its head. We can't afford it right now. No permission. But let's say permission is given. How would you go in?
Well, we have problems with all 3 northern gates. Herod's Gate is the closest entry point to our headquarters.
But why are you worried about the northern gate? Why wouldn't you go in through the Lion Gate?
That's not in any of our plans. We have a whole book of plans, but no one ever thought about Lion's Gate.
Then think about it.
But it faces east. Jerusalem has never been conquered from the east. Not since King David's time.
So it will be the second time. And the last one.
So does that mean...
No permission!
I feel that I'm listening to an historical moment. We and King David are giving the old city back to the Jewish people, 3,000 years apart, from the east. And I remember this until today, and my hair stands on end every time I tell this story.
All right. Well, that's all we're going to see tonight. I hope that whetted your appetite to see the rest of what happens. I want to, I apologize. I was going to mention that there is some pretty realistic war wounds in that. I hope that didn't gross any of you out too much, but I thought they really did a good job of showing what it was like and really reenacting it. I think about when I'm seeing that and the man who stood up and took 18 bullets for his comrades, and I think about what it says in Hebrews 11. He talked about those of whom the world is not worthy, and that's the way I look at men like that, who is willing to sacrifice their lives. And and I also think about in the context of today and where we are, and the war in Gaza and Lebanon and the terrible toll that we've seen in that. And yet, I don't think that we've had a day that we've had situations where there were 7 or 8 casualties, and that was so terrible. But these were so much bigger than that. And of course, it was a much smaller army at the time. So there was much that was given to secure that. So next week, Lord willing, we'll finish that. We might even get to talk about the 73 war before we're done, the Yom Kippur War. But that will be as far as we're going to go for right now. Maybe sometime in the future, we'll come back and pick up. I find this very interesting myself, and I thought it was, rather than me lecturing, I thought it would be more interesting for you all to see that reenacted, and I think a very, very good way. So, do we have any thoughts or anyone before we close, or is there any prayer needs before we go on?
That just makes me even more proud of their vision and their valor. Thank you for sharing this.
Lord, me too. Very thankful for that. Yeah, me too. That's true. And as we close, I want to mention that there are 3 hostages that are supposed to be released tomorrow, probably within a few hours. And just continue to pray for the hostage families. It's looking very. Some of the families are beginning to realize that their loved ones are probably not going to make it back. Because they know of 8 that are going to be 8 bodies that are going to be released, and it's really heart-wrenching situation. I can envision somebody a few years from now doing what we're doing, and it being about the Gaza war and going through all that. It'll be something to see what is made about this, the movies or history. It's the same story we're seeing in real time now, but I find it to be interesting to see the whole scope of it. And appreciate you all coming on tonight. And I'll try to get this posted in a few days for anybody that would like to watch again or share it or anything like that. So we appreciate you all, and thanks for being on, and we will see you tomorrow night, Lord willing. Those of you who would like to join us for our prayer meeting tomorrow night at this same time.
Thank you, Pastor Wayne. Thank you for all your research and presentation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pastor
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Night.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks for joining us.
Good night from the Main Street. Good night from the Main Street of Parker.
Love y'all.